Marilynn Preston. Welcome. When Tom Friedman was 15 years old, nice Jewish boy from Minneapolis, he fell in love with Israel. His first visit there in 1968, he says, changed his life forever. Well, today, Tom Friedman is the chief diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times. He's won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for his reporting in the Middle East, one in 1983 for his coverage of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and one in 1988 when he was bureau chief in Jerusalem for the New York Times. And now he's written a book, a wonderful book actually, called From Beirut to Jerusalem. And it goes way beyond the usual journalistic accounting of the Mideast crisis. Mr. Friedman speaks really as a journalist and as a committed Jew, and he combines history and analysis with deep personal feelings about the Middle East and many, many wonderful anecdotes. It's really a pleasure to read and a pleasure to have you here, so welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Thank you.
Especially being in the Midwest, so I feel I'm really back home. Not quite to Minneapolis, but almost.
Not quite. Fewer lakes here.
That's right.
I'd like to you to give us a little background about yourself. You say that you grew up with a real passion for Israel. Tell us about that.
Well, I went to Zionist day camps really all my youth, and went to Herzl camp in Webster, Wisconsin for 5 years, lived on a kibbutz all 3 summers of high school, and then went to, did a sophomore year abroad at the Hebrew University. So I had a deep interest, first in Israel in particular, and then in the Middle East in general, throughout my early years.
You went to Brandeis.
I got my BA from Brandeis, and I did a graduate degree at St. Anthony's College, Oxford University, also in Middle Eastern Studies.
And you learned both Hebrew and Arabic.
I studied both Hebrew and Arabic in college, yeah.
Now, you mentioned no journalism courses.
Never took journalism except in high school.
How did you land your first job?
Well, what I did in college was that I wrote op-ed pieces, editorial pieces on the Middle East for the Des Moines Register, where my wife was from, Des Moines, and for the Minneapolis Star and Tribune. And so by the time I went to apply for a job after graduating from Oxford, and I was in London at the time, I had a stack of clips, all of them op-ed pieces on the Middle East, and it was really on that basis that UPI hired me to write news. And I was very fortunate that they were ready to take a chance on me, since I had never written a news story in my life. The first news story I wrote was about the death of Keith Moon, the drummer for the band The Who, which was a long way away from where I'd come from, and also where I intended to be.
Which was in the Middle East.
Indeed.
And you went there?
I went there. I was hired by UPI in 1978, and in 1979 my boss came out and said the number 2 man in the UPI bureau had just been shot. He had been nicked in the ear by a man who was robbing a jewelry store in Beirut, and he decided that maybe Beirut wasn't for him after all. And my boss said, "We think you're the perfect guy for the job." And
you felt you were as well.
With that introduction, I thought, well, I'd prepared myself all my life really for a job in the Middle East, in Middle East journalism. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent there, and so it was time to either put up or shut up. So my wife and I packed our bags and we put up.
Let's talk about those early years, early 80s that you spent in Lebanon, and remind us of how chaotic conditions were there. The invasion in the spring of '82, Israel into Lebanon, the assassination of Gamal, the massacre at Sabra Shatila. Just give us a sense of the chaos that
Well, it
you
was
found.
the Wild West days of West Beirut. I came there in '79. That was when the PLO was really in charge of West Beirut. Yasser Arafat was the mayor Daley, so to speak. And then I was there for the Israeli invasion. I saw the Israelis come. I saw the Israelis go. I saw the PLO arrive. I saw the PLO go. I saw the Marines come. I saw the Marines go. Funny
and
place.
Die.
Yeah, I was there for the Marine bombing. Beirut, there was always somebody dying to get in and somebody dying to get out. And I was there to see many of them come and go. It was an exciting time, a fascinating time. And what made Beirut, I think, so unique as a place to live, so wild and crazy as it were, was not that people got killed as such. It's that they got killed playing tennis, or they got killed playing golf, or they got killed taking their kids to school. That's what gave it its bizarre and unreal quality. My wife and I were members in good standing of the Beirut Golf and Country Club. And when they talk about the first hole there as a dangerous par 5, they aren't just whistling Dixie. But it is a sort of surreal kind of place. And what made it surreal is that people were constantly struggling to maintain some normalcy in their lives, no matter how violent it got. As a man I used to play golf with in Beirut used to say to me, "I know it's crazy that I play, but I'd be even crazier if I didn't play." And that's really the anthem of the Beirut survivor.
You describe vivid, almost nauseating details of the random violence that you experienced there. I remember in the book you say that after experiencing so many car bombings, you tended to focus on the leaves instead.
Well, what I meant by that is that once you see enough of these kind of incredibly grotesquely violent scenes, you start to focus on totally absurd and obscure things, because you can't really look at it straight. You know, if you start to look at it straight, your eyes necessarily will want to be averted. And so what I found is after covering enough car bombings, I started to notice after a while that a car packed with 100 pounds of TNT, when it explodes with such force that it blows all the leaves off the trees. And when you come to the street, the first thing you see, it looks like an autumn lawn, basically. Only all the leaves are green. They haven't turned brown and fallen off. And or you notice the sort of broken whiskey bottles on the street and the smell of liquor, or some beautiful roast chickens that have been blown 100 yards away and still look good enough to eat. Those are the incongruities you start to focus on.
Is there also a numbing effect of all that violence that you carry with you forever?
Well, indeed. And one of the things that Beirut teaches you is that repression there, psychological repression, is actually healthy. Because, you see, the only way to survive a place like Beirut is not to contemplate, not to think about in detail all the dangers that are out there. If you start to think about them, you really go crazy. So you have to teach yourself to play mind games that enable you to survive. So I had a friend in Beirut, a Lebanese woman, who used to tell me every time she flew on an airplane, she always carried a bomb with her, because the odds of two people carrying a bomb on the plane were much larger. I mean, it was just a joke, but it was an example of the kind of mind games you play. Or if your neighbor got killed, the guy who lives just across the street, he got killed after a ceasefire went into effect. And there was always an explanation for it. You say, well, of course he got killed. He went out 15 minutes after the ceasefire. Everyone knows you're supposed to wait 16 minutes. Or, of course he got killed. He lived on the wrong side of the street. In other words, you had to impose a rational logic on it, because if you faced up to the truth, which was that it's all just callous fate that distinguishes you from the guy who got killed, you'd be paralyzed.
One of the truths, of course, that distinguishes you from anyone else is that you were the only Jew in Beirut, and really you were a Jew being bombed by other Jews.
Yet focuses your mind. I never sort of put it in those words, but I was sort of, I certainly described that, and that obviously accounts for part of the tension in the book, and the tension in me, and I think also accounts for the some of the better reporting I did, as I explained in the book. When I was covering Sabra and Shatila, which is what I won my first Pulitzer Prize for, I wrote a 4 full pages exposition of it, reconstruction of it in the New York Times. One of the things that was really driving me was that half of me really wanted to nail Begin and Sharon. I really wanted to show that they were guilty, that they had to have known what was going on, they had to have been responsible, in hopes that this would get rid of them, and in my own kind of way, save Israel. And the other half of me wanted to find excuses and alibis for Begin and Sharon, to hope that they couldn't possibly have known what was going on, to preserve my own image of Israel. And so it was that tension between the two which really drove me, and while an objective reporter is not supposed to have those kind of subjective feelings, in the end it actually made me, I think, a better reporter.
Certainly one of the strengths, I think, of the book is that you are so honest, that you allow yourself to see the situation both as a journalist and Jew.
Yes.
And
it's an honest book. I think it's an honest book in every direction, and we recognize that, myself and my editor, that would be the strength of the book, that it's honest in what I say about Arafat and the PLO. I pull no punches there. And it's honest to what I think I say about Israel, Arab politics, etc. And I feel comfortable with the book in that sense. I don't feel like I pulled any punch, or that someone's going to uncover something. Why didn't you say that? Or why didn't you say this? Or you're not fair. I was just on a radio show here, and was being criticized by one person for not being totally fair to the Arabs here. And my excuse has always been that, look, this is the journey. This is where I was. This is what I saw, and this is how I understood it. And I'm not here writing history. I'm not here writing some fact book on the Middle East, explaining it. This is the story of one man's journey.
When you speak of Yasser Arafat, you call him the Ronald Reagan of Palestinian politics. What do you mean?
Well, I really see Arafat as the Teflon gorilla, in the same way that Ronald Reagan was a Teflon politician. Nothing stuck to Yasser Arafat. Not failure, not any particular political position, and certainly not his military defeats. He was seemingly just resistant to all of these failures that he visited in a way on the Palestinian people.
He rose on his failures.
But yeah, exactly, in a way. At the same time, he was an enormous success in another way, in that he brought the Palestinian people from the deserts of obscurity to prime time. But he never got them from prime time to Palestine. That's his failure.
Is he doing that now? Or how do you evaluate his performance now?
I think that he's no closer really today than he was 5 years ago, really. I think that his profile may be higher. People may know more about the conflict, maybe slightly less sympathetic to Israel today, but I don't see the Palestinians any closer to Israel. They're still, to me, in the land of prime time.
So all of his acceptance and rhetoric about accepting Israel now, that Israel leadership is so wary of, you too are wary of.
Well, I don't believe in therapy in this part of the world, so I don't believe that Arafat suddenly had therapy, and he's a new man. It's just, this is an old part of the world, and it's an old and cynical part of the world, and men around here don't reinvent themselves overnight. So Arafat did what he did out of a political calculation, and if he follows through on that, and if the political calculus is right, he'll be able to cash in on his chips. But so I don't look at it, I don't believe anybody. I mean, I've lived out there for 10 years, too long. I think they're all bandits, I mean, in a way, so, and I know because I lived with them. And so when Arafat stands up and says, I recognize Israel, I mean, I always look at it like my grocer would look at it in Jerusalem. My grocer, he's a real tough guy. He's Iraqi Jew. He came to Israel. And my grocer says, look, my friend, you can tell the Swedes, you can tell the American Jews whatever you want. But you and I, we know each other. We've been at this for 100 years. So don't tell me you've had therapy and now you're a new man, because I know different. I know you and you know me. Now you tell me you recognize me. I know what I took from you. Some of it I bought, some of it I occupied, some of it I whatever. So I don't just buy that. Yes.
This attitude that you're describing now, in your book, when you speak of this, when you say that they're so into their past, that this distorts any hope of a hopeful future.
Well, I think that is one of the problems. I think one of the transitions really I saw in Israel is that when I went to Israel after the '67 war as a young man, Israel was future-oriented. It felt like you were in a country whose eyes were locked on the future. And I would say in the '80s, I feel very much that Israel is becoming past-oriented. That it's a country that seems to be absorbed with the past and the kind of dread that this may just be another cycle, that it is the fate of the Jewish people to dwell alone, that what I call in the book the Yad Vasheming of Israel, that Israel is turning into Yad Vashem with an air force.
Before we get into the second half of the book, which is all about Israel, I want to have another question about the first half, about Lebanon. You said that when you left Beirut that you cried, and that it changed your life in profound ways.
Well, part of it was, I think that emotion had to do with a particular relationship I had with my driver in Beirut, which is part of the book. My driver was a Palestinian from Jerusalem, and I, a Jew from Minnesota, and we were thrown together in this city, Beirut, at a particular time, and his wife and 2 daughters were killed in my apartment. My apartment was blown up actually by a group of Palestinians who were in a fight with another group of Palestinians over who would get empty apartments in the building. They were refugees. And so Muhammad lost his whole family there, and we went through just an enormous, searing experience together, a bonding experience. And part of the emotion was just leaving him behind after going through this experience with this man. I mean, that was as close as any experience I think 2 people could ever go through. And knowing that I was going off to a new world and a new future and leaving him behind in this hellhole that was Beirut.
You say that you wanted to nail Begin and Sharon for their roles, and now I read in the paper that Sharon is back again, and as strong as ever, if not stronger, a real powerhouse.
Well, the hammer, I don't think really kind of missed, I mean, if he was nailed. Yeah, Sharon, I'm not sure he was ever really gone, I mean, to be making a comeback. I mean,
but they say more, that he's really the powerhouse.
I think because Sharon feeds off the desire, or people like Sharon rise at a moment when you have people who are frightened, who are tired, who are enraged, and who look for some man on horseback who can cure it all, who can alleviate those fears, who can end the tiredness, and who can express their rage. And he's a barometer for that. He's a respectable barometer for that. Kahane we've labeled unrespectable, you know, a Rabbi Kahane. You know, him, you can't, it's not nice, you know, to sort of be supportive of him. But Sharon is kind of, in some ways, you know, a respectable version of that. And he is a man who rises in these moments of enormous tension. And this is a time of enormous tension, a time when Israelis are looking for solutions, and someone who seems to know where he's going. He seemed to know where he was going in Lebanon, too, and he led them into a dead end.
You characterize the Israeli political system in the book as paralyzed by lack of leadership and clarity. Those are strong words.
Mm-hmm. I'm full of strong words. Basically, one of the things that I found that unified or that linked Beirut with Jerusalem was that sense of paralysis that I found in both countries. In both Beirut and Jerusalem, I found countries that were each facing monumental existential questions. Who are we? What kind of society are we going to be? What is the shape of our society going to be? In Lebanon, is it going to be a multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy, or is it going to be an Islamic republic or a Christian republic? In Israel, is it going to be a biblical state, or is it going to be a modern political state, just like France, whose borders will correspond not with biblical boundaries, but political and security realities? So each state was facing that fundamental question, and each was paralyzed before it. In Lebanon, the paralysis came about because eventually no one was in the government. In Israel, the paralysis was because everyone was in the government. In Lebanon, they called the paralysis anarchy, and in Israel, they called it national unity. But the net effect was the same political gridlock.
You don't even see a real difference between Likud and Labor.
Well, I think that I don't see a functional difference, Marilyn. I really, and on this key existential question, what to do with the territories. Sure, if you look at their platforms, they're both different. And both sides love to point you to their platforms. But if you look at how they've behaved politically in daily life, there's really no difference. And I'll simply remind you that in America, advertising for products that are identical, like breakfast cereal and dog food, are the same. And so it is with Labor and Likud. They each point to their platforms and look how different we are from them. But in real life, in reality, they're each selling the same puppy chow.
Now Labor says that they're threatening to break away to end the coalition government because they don't like the hardline attitude that Likud is taking.
Right. Well, they've been saying that now ever since the national unity governments were first formed in 1984. If I had a dime for every time they said that, I wouldn't have need to write a book. I could have retired. If I'd had a shekel for every time they said that, I could have retired.
You think their posture, their willingness to come to the table and the plans for Palestinian elections would be identical, the same, or do you think there is a difference between
More or less. I think there would be nuanced differences, but not that much.
So who are they posturing for?
For the Israeli public and for the West.
The response from the West was to encourage them not to break apart.
Yeah, well, exactly, because I think we, the United States, recognize that if they broke apart, it would just be that much more difficult to get any, they'd be that much more paralyzed. And the prospects of getting any kind of concerted initiative based on a consensus in Israel, a stable consensus, would be virtually impossible.
I think one of the most delightful parts of the book are your portraits of the various philosophies and ideologies that coexist in Israel, that both connect and divide them. The problem is there's so many different visions. How can there ever be one vision? How can Israel survive with that kind of disparate vision at work?
Well, I think the answer is in your question, and that is that you said the visions that both connect and divide. That underlying those divisions are certain basic connections. It's not like Lebanon, where you have Shiite, vision of the world, and a Maronite Christian one and a Protestant one, and where all they have in common kind of is an agreement, is a balance of power. In Israel, there is this kind of underlying bond. I always like to point out the fact that the Arab world is always obsessed with unity. We're always hearing about Arab unity. Why? Because they know how underlyingly divided they are. The Israelis are not obsessed with unity at all. Their parliament looks like a souk, and people are shouting at each other and cursing each other. Why? Because they know how unified they are underneath the surface.
But are you seeing cracks in that unity? I mean, we hear about people that the Intifada has caused enormous strain on the population. I mean, deep philosophical strain.
Oh, I think there are cracks in that unity, but again, you have to ask sort of at what level. I think there are always cracks. That's what I'm saying. I mean, you see the surface, and the surface is this multiplicity of opinions. But I think that underlying it is still a deep bond, and that I wouldn't underestimate is all I'm saying, despite all the surface divisions.
You said that Israel's enemy is not just the Palestinians, not just the Arabs, but a big enemy is Israel's inability to escape the ghetto mentality that, of a Jew as a weak, helpless victim. So explain that.
Well, you know, when I think of Israel today, if I were to draw a cartoon of Israel, it would be of a lifeguard at a swimming pool. And this lifeguard will have passed every Red Cross exam in the book, and he's got muscles bulging from his toe to his head. And somebody comes along and pushes him in the water, and all he thinks he can do is tread water. That's Israel today. It's this incredibly powerful giant that has no sense of its own power, its own ability to shape its own future. Because although it's developed all these institutions of independence and modern statehood, it still hasn't escaped that ghetto mentality of the victim, of being the one who is acted upon and not acting, being the one who reacts and never initiates.
Now we see them not as victims, but as occupying forces. And the West, of course, is complaining about that. American Jews are, Israeli Jews are. Do you think that their response to Intifada has been appropriate, or perhaps they've overreacted?
Well, I think that there was necessarily going to be a military response to the Intifada. And that to me is, I'm not approving of it. It's just sort of analytically, it was logical to me that you're faced with someone throwing a stone. You're not going to tolerate that. You're going to engage in some kind of military action. It's going to be more or less repressive, more or less lethal, and one can certainly argue about that, whether the level of force was proportionate to the given threat. But I think, and so that's a question for military and security experts,
Well,
of which
what's your
I'm not,
answer?
but of which I'm not. To where I would fault the Israeli government is in the political response. This Intifada is a political explosion. It's an explosion of political rage and feelings, and it ultimately only has a political answer. And it can't just be all stick and no carrot. And really, since the beginning, that's how the Israelis have tried to deal with it. And you can't expect to put it down any more than the KGB can accept to smother the descent of Soviet Jews with purely military means. They couldn't break Sharansky's will with 10 years in prison. So why do we think that somehow what wouldn't work against Soviet Jews in the Soviet Union is going to work against Palestinians in the West Bank?
If it can't be all stick and no carrot, as you say, what is the appropriate carrot in your view?
Well, I think that in my view, Israel owes it to itself to take the initiative to see whether it can forge a settlement with the Palestinians that will guarantee Israel's legitimacy and security and future and the demilitarization of any areas it evacuates. That is, can it engage in a withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza Strip that will assure its security, free itself from occupying hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs, preserve the democratic and Jewish character of the state, and still ensure its survivability? Can it withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza Strip, allow Palestinian entities to be developed there, and ensure its security, or not? Now, the answer to that question may be no. Maybe there is no Palestinian partner on the other side whom Israel can really trust to engage in the kind of agreement and preserve it that Israel feels would be required for its security. Maybe not, but it seems to me Israel owes it to itself. It owes it to the future generation of Israelis and to the world Jewry in general to take the initiative to see if that's possible, to say, all bets are off, clear the table, come here, anybody, let's put all our cards on the table. You, Yasser Arafat, we know we're not dealing with Mother Teresa here.
But are you saying they should sit at a table and trust Arafat enough to begin negotiation?
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yes.
I have no illusions about Arafat. He ain't Mother Teresa. I know that.
What's
But
your
the point is that you've got to put him to the test. If he fails the test, then fine. But if he passes the test, it seems that everybody's better off.
The issue now, though, is that his second in command, Abu Iyad, who is a known terrorist, founder of Black September, Congress doesn't want us engaging in conversations talks with him and voted against it, even though Bush said it would be appropriate to do that. What do you think about it?
It's a tough call. On the one hand, I can understand those who say that this, I mean, especially this character, since he was implicated in the Munich massacre
Right.
and in the killing of the American ambassador in the Sudan. And so I can, in this particular case, really identify with those who say, what in the world are we doing talking to this guy? At the same time, I think we also have to recognize, do you want a deal or not? If you want a deal, then as Abba Eban always says, you don't negotiate with your friends, you negotiate with your enemies. Anwar Sadat was responsible for the deaths of a lot more Israeli Jews than Abu Yad ever was in launching the 73 war and the war and the fighting before that. Israel did a deal with Anwar Sadat because it felt it had an interest in doing a deal with it, that in the long run it would save Jewish lives. And I think the same question and criteria have to be applied to dealing with the PLO.
In your current job as chief diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, you're following around Secretary Baker. What is your sense of the Baker-Bush policy in the Middle East?
I think Baker and Bush look at the Middle East the way an obstetrician look at a couple who come to him and say, Doc, we've been trying to get pregnant for 40 years. We just can't conceive. And the first thing that obstetrician would do would be to determine whether that couple is really trying to get pregnant or whether they aren't just telling him that in the waiting room and then going back home and sleeping in separate bedrooms.
Do you doubt that Israel wants a peace? Peace?
I think it wants peace. It's a question of, is it ready to make all the necessary sacrifices and compromises for peace? You see, Israelis and Palestinians are always telling us and our secretaries of state, yeah, we want to get pregnant. Come on over. We want to nurture something. Come on over. But the truth is, they all want to get pregnant with us and not with each other. They want to nurture something with us and not with each other. And I think Baker and Bush want to make sure that they don't step into this diplomatic game before Palestinians and Israelis have truly demonstrated that they're ready to nurture an agreement together. That's really, what our role is to do, to help deliver that settlement.
One last question. It'll have to be a quick answer. In the book, you say that you see a real decline of American Jewish interest in the Middle East, in the Israeli situation. And this may be related to the Pollard affair, may be related to the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians. Do you think this is a serious issue?
Well, I think it is, because I think for a lot of American Jews who grew up at a time when people said you can't criticize Israel, it's like the kid who comes home and his mother says, don't say anything to your father that's going to upset him. Okay? And after a while, the kid says, look, Ma, I'm moving to the coast. I can't deal with Dad that way. I love Dad, okay? I'll always love Dad, but I can't deal with him that way. I'm going to the coast. I'm checking out. And I think for a lot of American Jews, they don't want to criticize Israel. They can't deal with it. They've gone to the coast.
It's not your case. You've criticized, but you've done a beautiful job. So
I've done more than criticize.
Check out his book, From Beirut to Jerusalem. Thank you for joining us here, and thank you all. Shalom.